Thank you very much. We are now going to listen to the first keynote lecture, which will be delivered by Professor Bruce Campbell and shared by Professor Mathieu Arnoux.
Hi, everybody. I am Mathieu Arnoux, and I am extremely honored to chair this first session of our conference. Every medieval historian in this place or online or elsewhere knows who is Bruce Campbell, and most of us, medievalists or not, are well aware of the importance of his 2015 published book, The Great Transition. I am delighted to invite him to speak and to open this first plenary session of our conference. Just a technical point, our colleague online may ask questions, and we try to pick this question for the discussion after Bruce's paper. Inside this hall, you may ask questions. You have to reach the microphone, and we beg you short and very clear questions, because on this stage, the audition is not absolutely optimal. Bruce?
Where is my... I can't. I have no cloth. There is cloth. There we are. Right. We're in business. We're in business. Good morning. And particularly good morning to all those here and all those who are all over the place and are tuning in online. My point of departure for this opening presentation is Africa, or to be a little more specific, Egypt. And I want to start by taking you back in time further than all but a handful of other speakers at this Congress, to about 3,500 to 3,900 years ago, which is the time it is thought that the events narrated in chapter 41 of the book of Genesis in the Bible may have occurred, as depicted here in this painting by the French artist Adrien Guignet. These events were essentially Joseph interpreting the dream that had so troubled Pharaoh. And Joseph's interpretation of that dream was that there would be 7 years of abundant harvests, followed by 7 years of disastrous harvests. And he advised Pharaoh that unless preventive measures were put in place, Egypt would suffer a most terrible famine. And his advice was to build public granaries and store the surplus of the good years against the deficit of the bad. And if you don't know the Bible version of the story, maybe you know the musical version of the story, with lyrics by Tim Rice and music by Andrew Lloyd Webber. In the secular age, it may be this is the version that you know the best. And it's a story I've chosen to open with because I think it speaks directly to the theme of this International Congress. It's a story about the reproduction of natural resources in a pre-modern world. It's a story about abundance and about scarcity, about the prevention of famine and the relief of famine when it actually occurs, about entitlements and inequality and the role of famine in developing or increasing both inequality and those with entitlements. It's a story about a state, an ancient state, with the capacity to act as a state for the public good. So it's about state planning, public administration, and regulated access to public granaries. And ultimately, and I think this is very pertinent to our own time, given the extreme natural hazards that are being recorded in the press all the time at the present day, it's the story of human resilience in the face of natural hazards. And intrinsic to that story are the waters of the River Nile, without which Egypt would be desert. As you can see from this satellite image, the Nile Valley is just a narrow ribbon of green amidst the sands of the Sahara Desert. And today, it accounts for just 6% of Egypt's area, but contains 90% of Egypt's population and the bulk of its water supply. The Nile is the world's longest river, and it is fed from two main sources. The White Nile rises in equatorial Africa and is fed by the equatorial rains, which are non-seasonal in their distribution. The Blue Nile and its lesser tributary, the Atbara, rise in the mountains of Ethiopia and is fed by the very seasonal Ethiopian monsoon. And if you look at this graph, which depicts the distribution of the flow out of the Nile, you can see just how seasonal that discharge is and how fundamental those monsoon rains are to the discharge of the Nile. And the monsoon rains start falling in July, peak in the beginning of September, and then abate. And until construction of the Aswan Dam, it was these monsoon rains that fed the celebrated annual Nile flood, which was fundamental to the irrigation system of the Nile Valley and fundamental to the renewal of soil fertility with the deposition of silt. That, of course, all stopped with the Aswan Dam, and it's going to be stopped even further by the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is currently filling within Ethiopia's borders. The strength of that Ethiopian monsoon is affected by four main things. First of all, it's part of a dynamic monsoon system, which exists when it's in equilibrium, in dynamic equilibrium. So there's an internal dynamic to that monsoon system and its connections to the Asian monsoon system. Is subject to short-term climate forcing by major volcanic eruptions, and there's a lot of very serious historical research looking at the impact of eruptions, particularly an Alaskan eruption in 43 BC may have been the trigger for a failure of the flood and serious famine at that point of time in Egypt. It's affected, as the whole of the global climate system is, by the amount of solar irradiance generated by the sun and global patterns of atmospheric circulation, which are thereby generated. And all of that feeds into the position and strength of what we call the intertropical convergence zone, which moves south in winter and north in summer. And Ethiopia, marked by that red asterisk, sits between the southern limit of the intertropical convergence zone and the northern limit of the intertropical convergence zone. And because so much depended upon the height of the annual flood, the ancient Egyptians built nilometers to monitor and measure and record it. This is the surviving nilometer on Elephantine Island near Aswan in the upper part of the Nile, and the height of the flood there could be used to predict the height of the flood as it would be several weeks later further down the valley. But the best known of the nilometers is this one, which still survives. I look forward to visiting it at some point in my old age on Rhoda Island, just across from Cairo. It's the best preserved, and not only is it preserved, but the annual record of the minimum and maximum height of the flood are preserved for an 850-year period, meaning that the Nile is the river in the world with the longest recorded record of discharge levels. And those annual recordings were gathered together by an Arab chronicler in the late 15th century. They were published in 1922, and as you can imagine, they have attracted a great deal of interest from a whole range of people, not least statisticians who love to play with this kind of time series data. And here it is, the 850-year record of the Nile's. I've just concentrated on the maximum height here, the Nile's maximum height at Cairo. And what you can see is how fluctuating and unpredictable over time was the height of that flood, upon which Egyptian agricultural output almost wholly depended. You can see why they needed to get some sense of what was going to happen. You can see the fear that would be generated if the flood was too low, if it failed, or if it was too high, and therefore terribly destructive of irrigation systems, of channels, of sluice gates, and all that went with it. And of the various studies of that data set, the one that I found most appealing is that by Zhang, Mendelssohn, Schwing, and Friedrich. And they apply coherency analysis to detect breakpoints in that chronology, points when the character of the flood shifted in a fairly systemic way. And for the first 700 years, the flood basically alternated between what they call normal periods, dry periods, normal period, dry period, long dry period there, normal period, short dry period, short normal period, back to a dry period. That was the established pattern for 700 years. And then abruptly, in 1341, the pattern changed. And the Nile entered, for the first time in its recorded history, a wet phase. It went, the height of the flood raised and remained higher, 1341 to 1394. The relationship between maximum and minimum heights changed in an interesting way between 1395 and 1427, and then it went wetter still from 1428 to 1469. So this is an entirely new episode, a new environmental episode that we can date precisely starting at the beginning of the 1340s. Not only did the level of the flood change, but its year-on-year variability changed. For a long period of time, that year-on-year variability was diminishing. But then, at the beginning of the 14th century, year-on-year variability began to rise. Now, if you're a farmer, what you need is predictability, certainty. And what you do not want is uncertainty, having to second-guess and often second-guess wrong what the growing conditions, the irrigation conditions are going to be next year. And the variability goes up. And you can see this very clearly here, long period of declining annual variability, and then suddenly a sharp upturn in variability at the time when the flood itself becomes more abundant. So what we have here is an example of an abrupt and autonomous environmental change in the supply of a fundamentally important renewable resource, water. And it's changed not for human reasons, economic, political, military reasons. It has changed for environmental reasons. But were these heightened flood levels a boon or a misfortune to a society which had long been accustomed to much lower levels? You might think, as economic historians, more water would be a good thing. This would be a beneficial development for an irrigation-based system. If you take a slightly shorter time period here, 1250 to 1500, you can see how the height of the flood goes up. There's more water. So that, you would think, would produce more agricultural output. But we cannot measure agricultural output in Egypt on an annual basis, but there are 5 points of time when my colleague Stuart Borsch has made estimates of Egyptian agricultural output. And paradoxically, Egyptian agricultural output goes down when the supply of water goes up. This is actually the opposite of what you might expect. And in fact, my late colleague John Munro reckoned that there was a 75% drop in Egyptian agricultural output between 1315 and 1517 over that 200-year period. So here we have the paradox. And how do we explain the paradox? Well, very simply, because there was another environmental variable that intervened in Egypt in 1347, namely the Black Death, one of the most devastating old world pandemics that we know of. It struck Egypt's dense population with devastating force and returned repeatedly over the course of the next several hundred years. And what it did is it destroyed the supply of labor needed to maintain the irrigation system at the very time that the rising floodwaters were placing increasing stress on that irrigation system. We needed more labor to dredge the channels, to build the dikes, to maintain the sluices. And at the very time that because of increased stress from rising flood levels, you needed more labor, you had less. And then amongst those who perished in the plague were people with skill and knowledge, and this created serious coordination failures between those who were locally and regionally responsible for keeping the irrigation system operational. And this chimes with the verdict of Shevket Pamuk and Maya Schatzmiller in their important study of the late medieval Egyptian economy, and I quote, labor shortages and fiscal difficulties in the aftermath of the Black Death led to deteriorating infrastructure and irrigation and declining productivity in agriculture. So here in Egypt, first almost 4,000 years ago, and then more recently in the 14th century, we see how the fickle reliability of the annual Ethiopian monsoon affected the height of the annual Nile flood, and therefore the food security of this agricultural civilization. And this is a civilization with a longer recorded history than almost any other society in the world. Floods that were deficient or excessive posed an ever-present threat to this sophisticated hydraulic society. And so Egypt, my first example, provides a classic illustration of the capacity for the supply of vital renewable resources. In this case, there are two of them, water and the labor force upon which the Egyptian irrigation system depended, the capacity of those to change and vary for independent, autonomous environmental reasons. Now, the study by Zhang, Mendelssohn, Schwing, and Friedrich engaged my interest, not just because of its analysis of the flood time series, but because of a more general point which they make. And I quote, climate episodes in Nile river floods were linked to climate variability in disparate locations via global teleconnection processes. I don't know how many of you in the audience have encountered this term teleconnection. It's beginning to come into historical usage. It's widely used by climatologists, paleoclimatologists, because although the global commercial and financial system is a relatively recent development, humans have always lived in a globalized world because the global climate system has always been interconnected on a global scale. And this is the idea about teleconnection process is that if you change climates in one part of the world, there will be knock-on consequences, sometimes for quite distant parts of the world. And so if you change the Ethiopian monsoon, you would expect that the monsoons would change right the way round the monsoon belt that encircles the world. For other monsoon reasons, we don't have records like those from the Nilometer readings recorded in the Chronicle. We have information that comes from natural archives, and in particular, for the South Asian monsoon, we have precipitation estimates that come from spilosems. These are stalagmites in caves that grow annually and are fed by water dripping into them. And we have the annual buildup of sediment layers in lakes and on the ocean shelf, which we call varves. And this is what happens. You take a cross-section through a spilosem, you get this. And on the right, you get a year-on-year analysis of the varves deposited in the Arabian Sea off the coast of Pakistan. And there are three precipitation indexes I've drawn upon here, from varves in the Arabian Sea, a spilosem precipitation index from Dandak Cave in India, and another spilosem precipitation index from Wangxiang Cave in China. And I roll them all together, and these are decadal estimates of precipitation across that wide band of the world from Pakistan in the west to China in the east. And you can see that over the 500 years, from 1000 to 1500, there is a very, very significant change in the magnitude and reliability of the monsoon. In particular, the 12th and much of the 13th centuries were dominated by a very reliable and very strong monsoon, and that was then replaced from the middle of the 14th century to the end of the 15th century by a very weak monsoon. Well, you can imagine if you are a water-dependent, rice-growing economy in Asia, and you turn down the water supply on that kind of scale, this will have very significant repercussions. And if I compare that with the discharge from the Nile flood, you will see that the discharge of the Nile flood, which is indirect measure of the Ethiopian monsoon and the South Asian monsoon, they're not seriously out of step for much of that period of wetness in the 12th and 13th centuries. But look at what happens here in the 1330s. In the 1330s, the Ethiopian monsoon decisively strengthens, and the South Asian monsoon decisively weakens. This is not a temporary phenomenon. This is a lasting change. And what we see here in the record is an episode of global climate reorganization. Just see how quickly that sets in and how profoundly it then develops. So what seems to have happened from about the 1330s, when global temperatures were cooling, the El Nino Southern Oscillation over the Pacific Ocean was weakening, is that the July position of the intertropical convergence zone seems to have been shifting. It seems to have been shifting north over Africa, but south over Asia, doing something rather like this, pushing north over the landmass of Africa, but pushing south over Asia. And if I take you 7,250 miles east from Egypt to Cambodia, to the Khmer Empire and its capital at Angkor, which I've never visited, but I'm sure there must be people here in the room and online who have visited this most remarkable UNESCO World Heritage site. We come to another hydraulic society, another society very dependent upon the monsoon. That city was abandoned and taken over by the jungle. It was abandoned in 1431, but for 500 years it was the capital of the Khmer Empire. And you can see, if I compare the period when the Khmer Empire was developing, coincides exactly with this period when the South Asian monsoon was strong and relatively reliable. You can see there a satellite photograph of Angkor, so you can see some of the still filled storage lagoons, and there was an absolute maze of irrigation channels. The city was at its zenith, the empire was at its zenith around about 1200 under King Jayavarman VII. When archaeologists who've investigated the site, because there were almost no written records apart from Sanskrit inscriptions incised in stone, so the archaeology has been hugely important to understanding this city. It's been described as the territorially most extensive urban complex of the entire pre-industrial world. So extensive was the area which it occupies. Low density city, but territorially a very, very extensive city of over 1,000 square kilometers. And it depended upon the irrigated cropping of rice, underpinned by a very complex system of water catchment, storage, and redistribution, which had evolved over many centuries. Because it evolved under relatively stable conditions over many centuries, it did not have resilience built into it. It lacked flexibility, and it lacked adaptability. It was fine as long as the rains could be relied upon. It ran into huge difficulties when they could not. And one of the things that was happening over the time with the development of the economy and the society and the growth of population was there was more and more land clearance. And that meant that there was greater exposure of the soil and the land to erosion should you have a particularly heavy monsoon. And so you need trees to retain your rainfall, and if you clear the trees, you'll have much higher runoff, much higher silting levels, greater problems of keeping your channels open and flowing. And crucial canals and reservoirs silted up and drains became blocked when the monsoon changed. And this, it is argued, brought about a cascading breakdown of the entire system. Once the system began to fail, it began to fail precipitously. Now, there were no written records, so how do we know what happened to precipitation? And here I'd like you to introduce to another source of information from another natural archive, from tree rings. And my school in the Queen's University of Belfast has Ireland's most important tree ring dating laboratories. I have colleagues who are dendrochronologists. I've had lots of very stimulating conversations with them over the course of my career. This is a drought index derived from the Fujian cypress, Phociania hodginsii, which is a rather rare tree which grows in Vietnam, which provides a very good index of rainfall levels. And here you can see years with good rainfall and years with bad. I'll highlight some of the good. 1257-58 was particularly wet. 1453-54 was particularly wet. These are both connected to major equatorial volcanic eruptions. Mount Rinjani on the island of Samalas in 1257, and the explosion of the island of Vanuatu in the southern Pacific in 1453. I'll also point out this year, 1316, it's a year for any of the European medievalists who are here which will ring loud bells in terms of Europe's own environmental history. But then look at the dry years. And what you have here for over 20 years is an unprecedented mega drought in its severity and its continuation. Out of the blue. Even worse comes at the beginning of the 15th century. The single driest record on this 750-year record is 1403. And the drought at the opening of the 15th century is shorter, but it's much sharper and more severe. There's another drought in 1424. Now, if we calculate the variance, the year-on-year variability on that series, this is what we get. On this principle that what farmers need is reliability, and in an irrigation system, unpredictability is hugely problematic, hugely challenging. So you go from a period from 1315 to 1340 of very extreme monsoon variability, then a mega drought, then even more extreme monsoon variability from 1389 to 1416. And then in 1431, Angkor is abandoned as the capital. Now, there's obviously a lot more going on than just the monsoon and the climate. There are military developments, there are political developments, there are social developments. So I don't want you to think that I'm giving you a lesson in environmental determinism. But the environment is an important contributing factor to the abandonment of this long-established capital city. And as Brendan Buckley and others who worked on this show, these mega droughts were not just specific to Cambodia and the Khmer Empire. You find them right the way across the monsoon belt. They show up in different measures in India, in Vietnam, and in China. So these are transcontinental events that fundamentally change natural resource reproduction right the way across a huge populous swathes of the earth. And this is why societies at a point in time when you might not think there are close connections between those societies display very similar chronologies of development. And what is underpinning their very similar chronologies of development is the overarching influence of environmental agencies. And Victor Lieberman picked up on this in his magnificent, really big, two thick books. It's a real test if you can read your way through both of these. And he uses this term, strange parallels, exhibited by the fates of monsoon-dependent hydraulic economies from Egypt to Cambodia. What they illustrate is the capacity of climatic teleconnections to drive synchronous shifts in renewable resources in otherwise relatively unconnected parts of the pre-industrial world. Now, China alone among these Asian societies possesses a long and detailed historical record against which the environmental record can be matched. Here are two climate reconstructions for China. The upper one is of precipitation, and the lower one is of surface temperatures. And what happened in China over these centuries is a humid and warm climate was replaced by a dry and cold climate with quite a short-lived tipping point between them at the end of the 13th and the beginning of the 14th century. This was a little unlucky for the Yuan dynasty, the Mongolian Yuan dynasty, established by Kublai Khan in 1271 and extended over the whole of China with the conquest of the Southern Song in 1279. So he came to power just at the very point, unbeknown to him, that China's climate was changing for good. And for China, we have reports of famines and reports of locust attacks. The Chinese reports of locust attacks are the longest available historical record for any such living creature on Earth. And these are annual counts. What I hope you can see is at the point when the climate tips, you get a great increase in the number of recorded famines and a great increase in the number of recorded locust attacks. And the locust attacks are very diagnostic. These are a clear indication of ecological stress. So a really good natural indicator of ecological stress. And these events have attracted the attention of two scholars in particular, whose work I now draw upon, Timothy Brooke and Tana Lee. And Timothy Brooks got very interested in the extreme events, the disastrous events, the famine events. And the first of these was at the point when the Yuan dynasty was founded, from 1268 to 1272. And when Kublai Khan came to power as a Mongolian, he embraced the Chinese Confucian policy of providing welfare to the victims of disasters in the form of cash and grain. And he adopted that policy. And then in 1273, he issued the world's first paper currency. And both of those decisions would have very considerable repercussions. The next set of disasters occurred between 1295 and 1297, and Kublai Khan was kind of lucky enough to have died in 1294, so he didn't live to see these consequences. And the English visitor from Italy, Marco Polo, had gone back to Europe by then, so he wasn't around to comment on what happened. And what happened then affected northern China much more than elsewhere. Locust attacks, very bitter winters, heavy livestock mortalities, and a flood of refugees moving south. 25 years later, again, it was the turn of China's bread basket, the Yangtze Delta and the southeast coast, to be badly affected by locust attacks, by super typhoons, and by flooding. And these caused very widespread famine and necessitated disaster relief on an unprecedented scale. You can see the references to famines absolutely peak in the 1320s. And the political instability that this engendered led to 6 Yuan emperors in 12 years. They just went down like 9 pins trying to cope with the difficulty confronting the dynasty. And then to cap it all, in the 1340s again, more environmental setbacks occurred with bitter cold, devastating flooding by the Yellow River, drought, locust, famine, you name it, they had it. And providing relief to the millions of hard-pressed famine refugees prompted the government to resort to desperate measures. And one of their measures was the printing of paper money. And those of you who are financial historians can work out what the consequences of that will have been. In order to provide the famine relief in cash, they just printed the cash needed to pay it. And it proved, it absolutely fueled dynastic instability. So here in Yuan, China, we have an example of a very large-scale, complex society, a sophisticated society, a developed society, with a highly developed state, whose renewable resource base across a geographically diverse and extensive area was progressively, repeatedly undermined by a succession of interconnected environmental shocks with a common origin in an era of far-reaching climate reorganization. And what is instructive is that specific institutional responses intended to mitigate these problems via the provision of disaster relief ultimately proved economically counterproductive and greatly compounded the government's difficulties. Well, Europe was not unaffected by these environmental stresses. It's not in the monsoon belt. It has temperate dry agriculture. It practices mixed agriculture. It's a very different agrarian base, but it too was exposed to these stresses. And Europe is very well served both by historical records and by environmental records. And here I'm going to turn to something perhaps a little more familiar to most of you in the audience, what we can learn by looking at grain prices. Starting with English grain prices, when I talk to my dendrochronology colleagues, they say, well, we can do year-on-year oak growth for 8,000 years. In Germany, the German oak chronology extends continuously and annually over 10,000 years. The longest economic record that I know of is the English grain price series that extends over a mere 800 years from the end of the 12th century. First, in the early 14th century, it was Northern Europe's turn to suffer when prices soared to famine levels in 1315 and 1316. And here they are. And on, to the side here, on the left, you can see a reconstruction of precipitation patterns across Europe in 1315 and 1316. And what I want you to notice is the very striking contrast between the wetness of Europe north of the Alps and the relative dryness of Europe south of the Alps. This is because there's a very strong northwesterly airstream sweeping over northern Europe and keeping southern Europe dry. The ecological stress which that engendered then precipitated a devastating panzootic of cattle. It's first recorded in Bohemia in 1316. It spreads west, reaches England by 1319, reaches Ireland by 1321. And in England, where we can measure its impact, it kills 60% of all the cattle, including many of the working oxen. It does this right the way across northern Europe. It is a highly contagious viral infection of horned animals. And then the harvest fail again in 1322, and this gives us the great Northern European famine. A famine on the scale of that Joseph had warned Pharaoh about, 7 years of hardship and deprivation, when not just the grain, but also the animals were very, very adversely affected. Things then eased in Northern Europe, and it was Southern Europe's turn thereafter. In 1330-31, in 1340-41, and in 1347. And note from this reconstruction of precipitation in 1330 that the distribution of rainfall over Europe has shifted, and this is because the northwesterlies have shifted south, because the North Atlantic Oscillation is weakening as part of the reorganization of global climates. And now it is Southern Europe's turn to experience extremely wet weather and consequent harvest failures. Same thing happens in 1347, where the hardship experience in the city of Florence is recorded in the chronicle of Giovanni Villani. In 1346, when food shortages began in the great Italian cities, their desire was to import grain from the Black Sea. But the Mongols who controlled the Black Sea had placed an embargo on grain exports in 1346. But they lifted that embargo. It's kind of bit topical, this. They lifted that grain embargo in 1347. So the Italians sent their ships into the Black Sea for the grain they desperately needed to feed their starving urban populations. And they returned bringing grain, rats, and the Black Death, which first broke out in the Crimea in 1346. Now, what I want you to note as economic historians is that prices in Northern and Southern Europe were asynchronous until 1332. There's a very strong negative correlation between them. Dear years in the north were cheap years in the south, and vice versa. And that flips in the early 1330s, so that by 1337 to 1347, there's a very strong positive correlation between grain prices in Southern and Northern Europe. And this is not because of market integration. It's simply that the climate forcing has become pan-continental in scale, as you can see from these climate reconstructions. It's now the turn of the whole of Europe to experience wet weather when the rains fall. The north-south divide across the Alps has been erased, so strong has the climate forcing become. And a sign of the stress is that Eastern Europe suffers locust attacks, and then there is very severe flooding. And you may remember the terrible German floods of last year, in July of last year, which were a repeat of the St. Magdalene's Day floods of July 1342, which is the wettest period on historical record in the river systems of Central Europe. And so the early 1340s again stand out as a period of environmental extremes and stress. And if you take a number of different annual measures, independent annual measures, and you calculate the variance of each and then roll them all into one, this is what you get. I've taken 6 different measures here to produce what I call an index of environmental instability. And what you can see is the way that year-on-year environmental instability is increasing throughout particularly the second quarter of the 14th century. Now, recently there was a survey of serious famine in Europe. It was a collaborative work edited by my colleagues Guido Alfani and Cormac O'Grorda, and they, in their editorial introduction, produce a table of the most serious of these. And I plot them here, and you can see there's a clear association with the point when the environment became more unstable and the point that famine became a growing problem across many parts of Europe. But note too that it was at the point of greatest stress of all that the biggest event of them all, the biggest demographic event of them all occurred, which was the outbreak of the Black Death. It's the point of greatest environmental stress that the Black Death occurred. And it occurred then because of a conjuncture of influences, climatic, social, ecological, to do with disease, the interactions between microbes and humans. A whole conjuncture of circumstances together engendered this greatest of old world demographic disasters. And in plague's wake, long-established relationships between humans and their renewable resource base underwent a profound readjustment. This happened in Europe, as I've already shown, it happened in Egypt. And one of the simplest ways to demonstrate this is to look at the GDP per head of some of the European economies for which we have reconstructions. So in thinly peopled Spain, the loss of numbers in that plague was more of a misfortune than a boon, and GDP per head goes down after the Black Death. In commercialized Italy, the contraction in population ushered in the short-lived cultural and economic efflorescence of the Renaissance, but that efflorescence, that economic efflorescence, did not last. In overcrowded and really rather backward England, fewer people proved to be more of a boon than a misfortune, and GDP per head went up, never ever to go down again to the levels that it had been at before the Black Death. And well, in Holland, they were laughing all the way to the bank, more or less. This is the beginning of the upturn that leads to the Dutch Golden Age in the 16th century. And all of these trends are indexed on their GDP per head levels in the first half of the 14th century. You see the divergence that begins to open at this point of time between these dynamic economies, or the economies which have proved to be dynamic in the long term in the southern North Sea, and the once dynamic economies of the Mediterranean commercial world, which ceased to be as dynamic as they had been during the commercial revolution of the 12th century. So temperate Europe proved more resilient to climate change than the sophisticated but institutionally vulnerable hydraulic societies of monsoon Asia. Climate change matters in the context of Europe, but much less than it mattered in the context of Egypt or of monsoon Asia. What made the real difference in Europe was a biological agent, plague, and it had the more transformative effect upon per capita output in Europe's very different regional and national economies. Well, this brings me to the Americas, and of course the Black Death did not cross the Atlantic, and because I'm running out of time, I'm not going to cross the Atlantic either. That story we'll have to keep to another time, but the Americas are caught up in this same episode of global climate reorganization. So instead, as this is a keynote address, and I have the great privilege to be the first speaker of this conference, I want to leave you with 4 key points. Seems to be a keynote address, should give you some key points. I have 4, which I would like all of you to reflect upon, to think about in your discussions in the papers and sessions over the rest of this week, and above all, to take away and act upon. And here they are. The first is data. We're social scientists. We gather data, we analyze data, We love data, okay? Climate historians, environmental historians have the same devotion, okay? What I've tried to illustrate in this lecture is some of the additional sources of information available to us as economic historians to help make sense of the world around us and the world as it has existed in the past. There are natural archives of speleothems, varves, tree rings, much else, that's ice cores, many other things, which are furnishing very high-resolution time series. And those high-resolution time series are then being used by the paleoclimatologists to reconstruct temperature series, rainfall series, patterns of atmospheric circulation. Those time series fill voids in the historical record, as they do in the case of Angkor, and they often extend over longer periods than even the longest historical time series. So here is a fresh and growing body of data with which economic historians interested in the reproduction of renewable resources and disruptions to that reproduction should engage. Secondly, there is the issue of agency, of causation. What I've tried to emphasize is that the environmental agents of climate and disease have repeatedly had the capacity to challenge and transform the relationship between human societies and the renewable resources upon which our societies have always depended. And this is absolutely a matter of concern in the world today. What is happening in the world today is not new. This has been happening through time. And here I'd like to quote my colleague John Book of Ohio State University from his book, Climate Change, The Course of Global History. And John writes, all too often, pre-modern societies suffered significant setbacks. But these setbacks were not driven simply by overpopulation, as Malthus supposed was the case, as by a combination of factors that always involve the play of exogenous natural forces, centrally climate change and epidemic disease. Human fortunes were never solely determined by forces endogenous to their social systems, although of course their social systems have always determined their responses and reactions to those natural forces. Thirdly, time. Here we are in France, in Paris, home to the truly great Annales School of History. The school of history that thought about change over time in the long term, in the longue durée, that studied history deep into time, not shallowly in just the recent past. There is a long back history stretching way back to the time of Joseph and Pharaoh and before then, to the complexity of modern interactions between humans and renewable resources. And the fuller understanding of that long back history enables contemporary resource issues to be seen in greater perspective. But I wonder and fear whether we are losing, as economic historians, that perspective. I spent an interesting 2 days going through the conference program and plotting the chronological coverage of the papers that will be presented over the course of this week. Over half of them focus on the period since 1800. Well, of course, this is a truly important and significant period to study. But earlier periods are falling by the wayside. Only 5% of them look at any period before 1500. Only a dozen look at any period before the birth of Christ. And I fear, as a medieval economic historian, that medieval economic history is suffering the fate of Angkor. It is being abandoned. And I would like the International Economic History Association to do what Pharaoh did and take preventive measures to prevent that. And then finally, I'd like to leave you all with a little wake-up call. I needed one of those at 7:20 this morning. The sibling subject of environmental history is a young but fast-developing interdisciplinary field. It is sexy and it is fertile, and it is bringing forth great harvest of interesting publications. It is also spawning major new data sets. It engages with big issues over long time frames. It has a global compass. It resonates with pressing contemporary environmental concerns. And as I know from teaching my students, it appeals powerfully to the young. Well, we can do this. We may have forgotten how to do it. We can do this. Economic historians need to wake up and engage with this fast-developing and cognate field. And I would very much hope that at the next International Congress, whenever and wherever that takes place, there will be some, in the parallel sessions, some joint sessions that bring together the environmental historians and the economic historians and their different data sets to bring those to bear on issues of common interest. But that's the next Congress. This is the current one. Have a great Congress, and thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Bruce. It was a magnificent lesson, and I strongly support the appeal for the longue durée and interdisciplinary research. Then we have to a brief moment. How many? 10 minutes for very short questions and very striking
Even shorter answers.
I have nothing on my screen, so if someone wants to go to the microphone and ask something to Bruce. Everybody has been convinced. We have.
Thank you, Bruce, for a wonderful lecture. I was triggered by two remarks that you made. One is that you were not a geographical determinist. You were not a geographical determinist,
yes,
right? And the other was about China, about the fact that you mentioned that the response of the Chinese government to the famines was ultimately ineffective because it eroded the position of the government itself. Would you know any examples of regions or countries or states that took measures that were effective in that very difficult situation? Or perhaps to phrase it differently, what could the Chinese government have done that would have been an effective response to the situation they faced?
Okay, I'm not sure quite, Jessica, how you want me to respond on the issue about geographical determinism. I would just make a quick comment on that. What I've learnt from trying to bring environmental history into economic history is that people say, well, this is just climate determinism. My response to that is no, I'm just increasing the range of variables that I'm building into my explanation. And I think we get better explanations by building all of the relevant variables into the story. And then you can work out which are the really important ones. On the Chinese question, I'm going to duck because I don't know enough to give an informed answer. And so I wouldn't want to try and pretend there are people who know much more about China here at this Congress than I do. I used it because it is an extremely intriguing example. And when I was using it, I had in mind the current predicament of the UK economy, where we've had a furlough scheme because of COVID, and the government has borrowed and borrowed and borrowed in order to fund the population during lockdown. And many, many economies have done this. And this is okay until the next disaster happens and we have to borrow again. This is all done on the assumption it is a one-off. And of course, in Kublai Khan's case, it was a one-off. He died before the full consequences of his decision began slowly but inevitably to come home to roost. And so I think it is that it's this time period over which you look at this. In the Chinese example, as it became an accumulative problem. And then when that sets in, how do you break the cycle? I don't have the answer to that. It seems to me it was the most ambitious example of state aid I know in a pre-industrial society.
Bruce, can you present yourself before questions?
Yeah, Lee Shaw-Taylor from Cambridge. Yeah, you described the European societies as more resilient than Egypt and the Asian societies you looked at. But I just wondered whether they're more resilient or are they just subject to much smaller shocks?
I think the resilience comes from the fundamental difference in two things: population densities. Rural population densities are much lower in Europe because of the nature of the farming system. The farming system has greater resilience built into it. So I give you the farming system I know most about, which is the English farming system. It's a mixed farming system, so it grows a mix of grains, winter grains and spring grains. It's a mixed farming system that combines the production of grains with grass and animals and a range of domesticated livestock, 2 different draft animals, horses and oxen, sheep, cattle, swine, and so forth. So what happens if it gets colder and wetter? You grow more oats, you have more grass, you keep more animals. There's an inbuilt adaptability in Northern Europe, much less so in Southern Europe. So I would find it very hard, in my knowledge of Northern Europe, to pull out an environment-triggered famine, for example, that has anything other beyond a very short-term, big, traumatic, but short-term impact. It seems to me the longer-term impacts are the disease impacts, because they endure. And agriculturally, the longer-term impacts in agriculture are the livestock diseases much more than the harvests. I don't know if that's an adequate answer to your question.
I'll come back to you later.
This works. Thank you very much for a very interesting introduction. I'm a strange animal in this room because I work mostly on daily Russian, East European politics, working at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. But I really appreciate your call for this longue durée approach that you somehow presented when you were talking about the import of the plug from Crimea to Europe. We have seen quite recently an agreement being signed by Russia and Ukraine and Turkey on the export of Ukrainian grain. Hope very much that this is not going to have the same implications for Europe as the one that was exported in 1346. But really the idea of placing those current events, and I use this term quite consciously because it's one of this Brodelian tried longue durée, conjuncture and event, that there is a clear need to place those events that I'm working mostly on in this both conjunctural and long durée perspective. So really appreciate it. And I was also working a lot on energy transition, climate change impact on debate on energy, which is also something that you have demonstrated very clearly that needs a lot of attention also in this longer historical perspective. So thank you very much for illuminating all of us in this room. Thank you.
Thank you. That's the kind of question I like. I don't have to give an example.
Hi, thank you very much, Guillaume Dodin from Université Paris-Dauphine, PSL. You've presented us, shed new light on the dramatic events.
Guillaume, take your mask off. I have no chance of understanding.
Yeah, sorry for that. You shed a new light on the dramatic events of the 14th century, and I was wondering how exceptional you thought they were. I mean, historically, it's probably the only ones that is that well documented, but maybe our friend from economic history can tell us, from environmental history, can tell us if that is a once in a millennium event or once in 10 millennia event, or what is the frequency of the events you call us to focus on?
Well, really, if you want the answer to that, I suspect you need to come to the session on ancient societies taking place this afternoon. When I began researching the Great Transition in 2010-11, I didn't know that this was an episode of global climate change. And it was only when I began to work with the data it became clear to me that things were changing fairly simultaneously all around the world. So I wasn't the first person to discover that, but it was not at all in mainstream knowledge. And when the very eminent environmental historian John McNeill reviewed my book, he said that my book, he said it's a book by a mature historian. I think he probably meant an elderly historian. But the climate science is not yet mature, because this is all very, very new stuff, and our understanding about the climate change is going to change dramatically as more and more evidence comes along. And more evidence is coming along because such is the contemporary concern about global climate change. There is money to fund this research. That's why the results are coming thick and fast. And the last period of significant global climate warmth was in 1000 AD. This is brilliant for medieval historians. They really want to know what it was like in the 11th and the 12th centuries, our last significant period of global warmth. The point about the 14th century is I don't think it was the most pronounced episode of global climate reorganization, Guillaume, but it's the one that comes most clearly now into focus. And it's the one where we have the evidence of the societies and the economies. This is why medieval economic history is hugely important. We need to study the documentary record of the societies all around the world at this time to put that alongside what we're learning about what is happening environmentally. Now, there are other earlier episodes of big climate change. The Roman historians have engaged with this. Karl Harper books, The Fate of Rome, is all about climate change and environmental change and so forth. The mistake that people make is assuming that planet Earth is stable, physically and biologically, and it never has been.
Thank you, Bruce. I guess this is the final, your final answer, but Liliane wants to say something on behalf of the organizers.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for this wonderful lecture which opened perfectly the Congress. We would like to offer you a present.
Liliane is an absolute saint, complete saint, because I very early on was told to shield myself from COVID, and I've been hiding in deepest Donegal for 2.5 years. So she's had various emails saying, I'm not coming, I can't do this. And she has remained cool, calm, and helpful throughout. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you so much to all the audience, and especially to Professor Mathieu Arnoux. And now we are inviting you to have a coffee break and then to begin the sessions.